Welcome to the podcasts of DiscoverGreece.com, where we give you all the travel inspiration you need to dream about and plan your next trip to Greece. Our podcasts are designed to add even greater depth and color to your holidays. We explore local traditions and culture, bring museums and archaeological sites to life, and we go to the source of the Mediterranean food and drink we all love so much. Most of all, we look for the stories of the people behind the travel experience. Think of our podcasts as a first glimpse of the memories you'll be taking home when you visit. This podcast is all about the Asclepion of Kos and the legacy of Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine. If you're in Kos right now, or you're planning a trip there, there's a good chance you've already heard of the Asclepion of Kos. Even in ancient times, it was the most famous monument on the island, as one of the renowned Asclepia, the ancient healing sanctuaries built to worship Asclepius, the god of medicine and healing. We have a whole podcast dedicated to Asclepius and the sanctuaries named after him, which is worth listening to before this one. But right now, we're going to ask you to imagine yourself transported to Kos, where you stand before the remains of the Asclepion. There's greenery around you, including a forest of cypress trees. You can smell Mediterranean herbs in the air. And there are views all the way to the Aegean Sea, around 3 kilometers away. We know from finds here that the area was probably used in Mycenaean times and in the geometric period. In other words, from around 1600 to 750 BC. Much more important to this story, we also know from written references that the god Apollo was worshipped here from the 5th to the first half of the 4th century BC. In fact, Apollo was known here as Apollo Kyparisios, after the forest of cypress trees, which belonged to him and was protected by sacred law. So, we can assume that there was possibly a sanctuary dedicated to Apollo here and that it was probably destroyed by an earthquake that was recorded in 413 or 412 BC. We also know that in the first half of the 4th century BC, the ancient capital of Kos, known as Astipalea, was moved to the area where the capital of Kos is located today. Ancient sources tell us that this was around the time that the cult of Asclepius, who according to myth was the son of Apollo, first appeared in Kos. But the exact date that happened remains unknown. What we can say with more certainty is that the cult of Asclepius was at its height on the island during the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BC, and that this required the healing center of a similar stature. This was the context in which the Asclepion of Kos, as we know it today, developed into one of the most famous healing centers of ancient Greece. It was a project that the people of Kos took very seriously. Before they started the work, they visited the Oracle of Delphi to gain the favor of Apollo, who was worshipped there. The first construction phase was during the Hellenistic period, from the first half of the 4th century BC, and was completed in the 2nd century BC. That may seem like a long time, but keep in mind that the flow of visitors and the needs of the site were increasing all the time. It took centuries for the Asclepion of Kos to reach its final monumental form as a unified complex of buildings and temples. And it didn't end there. 2 more construction phases followed during Roman times in the 1st century AD and between the 2nd and the 3rd centuries AD, when it remained as popular as ever. But hold on a minute. If you've listened to our podcast on Asclepius, you'll know that the god of medicine was born in Triki, modern-day Trikala, in the Thessaly region of mainland Greece. So, how did the cult that started in Thessaly and was already famous at sanctuaries like the Asclepion in Epidaurus in the Peloponnese find its way to the island of Kos? There are a few interpretations to this question and they all have to do with our protagonist, Asclepius. As to how exactly the cult of Asclepius came to Kos, there are various opinions. One says that it was introduced by the Epidaurians, who built the sanctuary. The second claims that the cult came directly from Triki in Thessaly. However it got to Kos, it was embraced by the people there and enhanced by the legacy of Hippocrates. The Asclepion of Kos gained enormous fame. It wasn't long before it was as important as the Asclepia in Epidaurus and Triki. How important? Well, just consider that in 242 BC, Kos managed to secure protection from war or other hostile acts from all Hellenistic cities. Part of this immunity was through its hosting of the Great Asclepias, which were a series of athletic and artistic events involving many Greek cities. Similar games were held in honor of Asclepius in Epidaurus. All of this brought prestige and national recognition to Kos. We've talked about the history, but what was it like to visit the Asclepion of Kos in its prime? The truth is that the sanctuary developed over quite a long period of time, so we'll have to merge some of these periods to get a full picture. The first thing you'll notice when you visit today is that it was built on 3 levels, connected by grand marble staircases. Imagine yourself climbing the marble staircase to the first level. You arrive at a monumental entrance, the Propylaeon, as it was called, introduced in the 2nd century BC. Before you, there is a kind of square courtyard, which was also a treatment area for patients. On 3 of its 4 sides, the courtyard was surrounded by a portico in the shape of the Greek letter pi. We can only see the foundations today, but it was decorated with statues, and at the back were rooms for worshippers and patients. On the 4th side was a wall that wasn't covered by the gallery, and this opened onto another large marble staircase leading to the 2nd level. The wall had fountains with running water, supplied by the 2 nearby thermal springs, the Kokkinonero, with its iron-rich water, and Vurina, which still supplies the town of Kos. During Roman times, niches were created in the wall where statues were displayed. Adjacent to the wall, there was also the Temple of Xenophon, which got its name from a local doctor who donated a statue of the Roman Emperor Nero to the temple. The Roman period saw the extension of the first level to meet the growing needs of the sanctuary. Toilets were added, as well as hot and cold baths, changing rooms, a palestra, which was a space for wrestlers, boxers, and other athletes to train, and an outdoor swimming pool. Let's keep going. The buildings of the 2nd level mainly served the religious needs of the sanctuary, and there was direct access from here to the sacred grove of cypress trees. At the center was the oldest surviving building in the sanctuary, the altar to Asclepius, built in the middle of the 4th century BC and later rebuilt during the reconstruction phases of the Hellenistic period, when an Ionian temple dedicated to Asclepius was added and most probably served as a place to keep the revenues of the sanctuary. Also on the 2nd level was the abaton, where the most mystical part of the treatment of patients took place. The abaton was the dormitory and where the process of the egimesis took place. After praying to Asclepius and performing an animal sacrifice, patients would sleep in the dormitory. While they were sleeping, Asclepius would appear in their dream. He could be alone or with his daughters or with his sacred symbol, a snake, and he would show the patient what treatment they needed. Sometimes he even performed the treatment directly while they were asleep. The Asclepiads, who you could best describe as priest-doctors, would then describe these dreams to the high priest, who would decide on the therapies, and the treatments were then overseen by the Asclepiads. Elsewhere on the second level was a semicircular platform where statues were placed, and a rectangular building called the Leschi, which was probably a place to store valuable votive offerings and for visitors to rest. Finally, in Roman times, a Corinthian temple dedicated to Apollo, the father of Asclepius, was added. Leaving the second level, you reach the final level of the sanctuary, again by climbing the marble staircase, which would have been decorated with statues on either side. Arriving at the top, you see the great Doric temple of Asclepius, which was the most impressive building of the sanctuary and a copy of the temple of Epidaurus. It was the largest temple dedicated to Asclepius in ancient Greece. There was another pie-shaped gallery surrounding it, with rooms at the back for worshippers and patients. During early Christian times, a church was built in front of the temple, which was part of the monastery of Patmos. In one form or another, this was what the Asclepion of Kos looked like for over 700 years, until the 4th century AD. It was eventually abandoned, probably because of the effects of 2 earthquakes in its later years and the spread of Christianity. When Kos came under the rule of the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, from the 14th to the 16th century, parts of the sanctuary were used as building material for the construction of the medieval castle of Neratia, which you can still see today in the town of Kos. And one last thing. If you've listened to our podcast about Asclepius, you might be wondering where the gymnasium and theater are. After all, there was also the Great Asclepia Games to host, and we know that Asclepian medicine in ancient Greece was about healing both the body and the soul through exercise and art. So, visits to the gymnasium and theater would have been important parts of patient therapies. Well, excavations haven't revealed them, but it's also possible that these needs were met by the stadium and theater found during excavations in the town of Kos. We simply don't know. No podcast about the Asclepion of Kos would be complete without taking a deeper dive into Hippocrates. The biographical information we have about him is often in the realm of myth, so the task of distinguishing truth from this myth remains difficult. What we can do is present his life and work, especially in terms of his influence and his legacy. There are references to him being born on Kos in 460 BC and dying between 377 BC and 351 BC, but archaeologists can't agree when exactly. We are told that he was the son of Heraclides and Phenarete, who was apparently related to Hercules. Wait a minute, Hercules? We know that Hippocrates was a real person. So how can he have been related to the mythical hero Hercules? The truth is that it really shouldn't surprise us that Hippocrates' lineage has a mythological dimension. People in antiquity had the need to associate the most important people of their time with the gods. We also have descriptions of Hippocrates' direct relationship with the Asclepion of Kos, which played a decisive role in the development of his medical knowledge and how it was transmitted to future generations. Hippocrates learned the art of medicine from his father and grandfather, both important doctors and Asclepiads in their time. And he had the good fortune to study the art of medicine at the Asclepia of Kos and Cnidos on the coast of Asia Minor, another of the most significant healing centers of the ancient world. He basically grew up in the Asclepion of Kos, where he would have interacted with patients from all over Greece, learning from their medical cases and enjoying direct contact with the staff, especially the Asclepiads. The Asclepiads recorded their patients' illnesses and cures on marble inscriptions, which they placed inside the sanctuary. This would have been another important source of information for Hippocrates, especially in the fundamental therapeutic values of Asclepius. The impressive thing is that some of these inscriptions have survived and you can admire them in the epigraphic collection of the Asclepion of Kos. But there was no stopping Hippocrates' thirst for knowledge. He began to travel throughout Greece, having conversations with philosophers, doctors, and patients. He traveled for 12 years in all, studying the environmental conditions of different regions so that he could understand their influence on people's health and learn from the cases of even more patients and about different medical techniques. In this way, his fame grew far beyond the boundaries of his place of birth. And with his more rational rather than mystical approach to medicine, he was called from various parts of ancient Greece to treat diseases and serious epidemics. So, what were his medical principles and what made him so different to Asclepius? Well, Hippocrates based his approach on observation and experiments. He followed the principles of objective recording of data, which allowed him to order his observation and his research on the human body. In other words, he was able to systematize the empirical knowledge he had acquired and classify diseases into categories according to their symptoms. He observed how the same disease might be treated differently from person to person, depending on the makeup of their body, and at the same time, he placed emphasis on the causes of a disease. In this way, a major part of his focus was on the diagnosis, but also the prognosis and prevention of an illness. Hippocrates treated the human body as a whole rather than as individual parts. His treatments were mild and mostly drawn from nature, especially herbs, which were abundant around the Asclepion of Kos. He also taught the need of good nutrition, hygiene, and fresh air. And it wasn't just about the body. He believed that a human is a psychosomatic whole, and in particular that the psychology of a patient and their way of thinking played an important role on the treatment of disease. These last points weren't so different to the therapies of Asclepius. The big difference is that for Hippocrates, illnesses weren't a punishment by the gods. Rather, they came from natural causes, hereditary conditions, and the person's environment. In the same way, he believed that thought was guided by the brain rather than the heart. He left behind the theocratic doctrine of Asclepius and introduced a scientific approach to medicine. He was also a modest, intelligent, honest, and selfless man. And he taught about the importance of medical ethics for physicians, which became enshrined in the Hippocratic Oath, a version of which is still taken by medical school graduates today. Hippocrates spent the last years of his life in Thessaly. He died in 377 BC, and whether he was in his 80s or 109 at the time, he lived to a ripe old age. His tomb is said to be somewhere in the Thessaly region, but its location is still a mystery. His legacy revolutionized medicine, not just in antiquity, but in modern times. His emphasis on the importance of careful observation and detailed documentation of symptoms and the course of diseases laid the groundwork for clinical observation and case studies, which are the cornerstone of modern medical practice. In ancient times, he played a pivotal role in transforming the practice of medicine from a mystical and religiously influenced approach to a more systematic, scientific, and rational methodology. In other words, under Hippocrates, medicine became a profession. Today's journey was brought to you with the support of Ecos Resorts. This is where we say goodbye and hope that you enjoyed this episode of DiscoverGreece.com's podcasts. If you want to hear more stories from around Greece, follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Apple Podcasts. See you soon.